As I've been thinking about doing this teaching on Revelation, God has raised a correction that's going to be important for us to understand. Previously, when I've taught about the seven kingdoms, I've taught that from Daniel 2, we know that the kingdoms start with Babylon because of the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, and because Daniel says that head of gold is you, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, the kingdom of Babylon. So we count down Babylon, Medo-Persia. Medo-Persia fell to Greece. Greece fell to pagan Rome. Pagan Rome fell to papal Rome. And then we learn in Daniel that papal Rome is a divided kingdom made of these two substances that don't really adhere to one another, baked clay and iron. And so we're told right off the bat, this is going to be a divided kingdom, and it ends there. That chapter ends there, as far as the kingdoms are concerned. And so it would make sense that you would then count down from papal Rome to, well, who brought down papal Rome? And then who brought down that? And then who brought down that, right? So historically, I've taught Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, pagan Rome, papal Rome. Papal Rome fell to Napoleon, because Napoleon, remember, captured the Pope. And that, as Daniel 11 says, put an end to his insolence and turned his insolence back on him. And I believe that that's still talking about Napoleon, Daniel 11:18. However, if you look, historically speaking, if you look at who brought down papal supremacy, it was a number of factors. It wasn't just Napoleon. Napoleon had a large role, but so did Protestantism. So did this divided kingdom of the mother, Babylon the Great, the harlot Catholic Church, and the prostitutes that bore out of her, that want to be so separate from her, these prostitute daughters, as is spoken of in Revelation 17. They want to be so separate from her. They always are fighting against her. They always talk about her and talk about each other, but they practice in the same prostitutions. The image of the cross, Sunday and Saturday Sabbaths, which came from Rome. God hasn't named any of his days. He's counted them down from the new moon. That came from Rome. You cannot deny that. It didn't come from God, nor does it jive with his calendar. Christmas, Easter, tithing, which was fulfilled through sacrifice. So I've always taught that Napoleon took down papal Rome, and then the United States took down atheistic communism. But see, the Lord started stirring me on this, because this is a teaching that I have acknowledged in many videos came from Kenneth Cox, who was a pastor in the Seventh-day Adventist church. And I did discern the teaching, but there's this part about Napoleon representing atheistic communism that has always bothered me. Although everything else fits, everything else is correct. It's just God is correcting this today. So the United States is the false prophet. It's not that Napoleon was not involved in taking down papal Rome, but Napoleon does not represent the Sixth Kingdom. And he does not represent atheistic communism. Bonapartism and communism are different ideologies. They're not the same ideology. So it can't be that Bonapartism turned into atheistic communism and then the United States came and took it down. That's not what God is talking about anymore. So he's established kingdoms of the world, and in true God fashion, in his pattern, he's established this concrete thing in order to help us to understand spiritual things. And so from this point on, where you have those 5 physical kingdoms in the world, now it's turning into a spiritual kingdom from that 5th kingdom on. Partly of iron and partly of baked clay. The iron really representing like this, worldly kingdom of Rome, and the clay representing a spiritual kingdom. And so from this point on, we have to understand it in a spiritual way. And it makes sense to me that God separated this understanding out into sections. Obviously, the Bible was not written into chapters, but there is a clear separation of sections of what he is explaining. So, for example, in Daniel 2, he's explaining these physical kingdoms, and then by the fifth kingdom, it starts to be understood that this is now spiritual and that it's going to be divided. And he talks a bit about those kingdoms in Daniel 7, and then again in Daniel 11, he's talking about the divided kingdom. One kingdom with a king of the north and a king of the south, and the king of the north is defined as the one who's in power within this kingdom at a given time. Now, you should understand a divided kingdom already from Scripture, shouldn't you? Because the kingdom of Israel was divided into two through Solomon's son, Rehoboam. So it shouldn't be confusing to you that you can have a kingdom that has division and different kings within it. Well, this is a spiritual kingdom, a kingdom based in false religion that at any given time has a king who's in power. And so it starts out with the king of the north being Catholicism and the king of the south being Protestantism, and they're at odds, and it describes that battle between them. And as time progresses, Protestantism, the prostitutes, gain power, and they become the successor in verse 20 of Daniel 11, who send out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor of this kingdom, of this harlot. That is your counterfeit tithing. When Paul received a gift, he acknowledged it as a gift. He didn't acknowledge it as, this is your responsibility because you're paying me tithing. He acknowledged it as a gift, and he said, not that I need this, but I desire that it be to your credit. When Paul was making collections, those collections were for the poor. That was clear. So there was no tithing, because tithing was already fulfilled through sacrifice. It had always been associated with sacrifice. And when Jesus fulfilled that, tithing was no longer a thing. But it has been implemented in the prostitutes in order to maintain the royal splendor as a counterfeit doctrine, to make a marketplace of God. You can't serve both God and money. And again, here in verse 18, you see that there was also the facilitation of this commander who puts an end to the insolence of the king of the north, the harlot Catholic Church, and turns his insolence back on him. But notice that that commander is not being referred to as the successor. It's actually the Protestants who are the successor. They're the ones in the kingdom, because the commander's not part of that kingdom. He was an external force who came in and facilitated the downfall. But within this divided kingdom, this successor sends out a tax collector to maintain the royal splendor, but in a few years he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. Okay, so now it says, after this, harlot Catholic Church, will turn back toward the fortress of his own country, but will stumble and fall to be seen no more. No longer in power. It has power, but it's no longer the king of the north. It's no longer the dominant power. So the entire chapter of Daniel 11 is describing a transfer of power. Who now becomes the king of the north? And whoever is taking the sort of back seat is becoming the king of the south. So the Protestants have victory for a short time, but something else comes along to mobilize the counterfeit narrative and to gain power. And that's the false prophet of the United States. It sort of takes over the power. And you see this sentence here in verse 20. In a few years, however, that Protestantism, prostitutes, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. By the way, prostitutes is coming from Revelation 17, and I prefer to use that term because not everyone considers like Mormonism or Jehovah's Witness, for example, to be Protestantism. But they're definitely prostitutes because they continue in the prostitutions of the harlot Catholic Church. Sunday, Sabbath, Christmas, Easter, the very structures that they use in their worship. 1 Corinthians 14 said each of us is supposed to bring something to the assembly. It doesn't say that there's a pastor at a pulpit spoon feeding you their version of Christianity. It says get involved in your covenant. None of these people are doing this. They have a structure, a hierarchy that is modeled after their harlot mother, the harlot Catholic Church. So you see here that it says, in a few years, however, he will be destroyed, yet not in anger or in battle. They gladly handed over their power to the false prophet of the United States to mobilize their narrative, to define their Christianity. And we learn in Revelation 13 that what it's been doing is testifying to the Antichrist, testifying to all of this falsehood that was established by the harlot Catholic Church and continues in her prostitute daughters. And not only that, but it's mobilizing a narrative and giving power to an image that it has created for this Antichrist. And that image is counterfeit Israel. And it is giving power to that image. And in Revelation 17, we learn that the 10 kings or horns that were the Germanic tribes that came out of Rome, were really tormenting Rome, that became Western Europe. We learn that Western Europe is going to receive power with the Antichrist. So let's just pause a minute. So let's just check some boxes, okay? Has the false prophet of the United States given power to the image of the Antichrist that is counterfeit Israel? Yes. As a matter of fact, blank check, power and support. Has Europe received power along with the Antichrist? Yes. Testifying to the image, its alliance. You're seeing it right now. Look at the NATO conference. Does it receive power alongside this Antichrist, this prince of the Antichrist covenant that is the United States? Yeah, they receive a lot of power through NATO. That's why they're kissing his butt and groveling right now. All those checks are there. The word also says that it's going to receive power for 1 hour. Europe will receive power for 1 hour along with the beast. But its purpose is to hand over its power and authority to the beast. Does it do that? You betcha. It testifies to the false prophet, and it testifies to the image of the Antichrist, and it has given a lot of support to it. So just making sure that we're doctrinally sound, and that what we see happening right now is indeed what has been prophesied. So it's not upset about handing its power and authority over to the false prophet. Neither are the prostitutes upset about that, because they consider that they're under the shelter of this false prophet, and they consider that they have the same agenda. And the false prophet probably isn't going to be upset about it either when they hand over their power and authority to the image of the Antichrist, because they don't seem upset about it now, do they? And you see that the image of the Antichrist is distributing loot and plunder among its followers. Well, let me see. Do they do that through their lobbying groups? Do they pay off the politicians in the United States? Yeah, they do. So ultimately, what we're looking at is a spiritual kingdom. God established physical kingdoms in the world for us to understand this culmination right now. And so it does make sense that God would have had me kind of wondering about this for a while as he brought me into the transition to understand, no, what I'm talking about and what I'm concerned about is a spiritual kingdom. And so from Daniel 2 on, kingdom number 5 has begun a spiritual kingdom. And in Revelation 17, we know that that spiritual kingdom is controlling the beasts, okay? That the woman is riding the beast, that the woman, church, spiritual, is controlling the kings of the earth, fornicating with the kings of the earth. And so though you look at the false prophet and you think, well, the thing that's in power is the government, no, the government is being used by the woman. She's controlling that beast. The same thing goes for counterfeit Israel. The same thing went for the harlot Catholic Church or the Church of England, which of course directs government. Hopefully this helps to bring Daniel 11 a little bit more into view, into clarity, because it did seem for a while to be a little bit random. I mean, he did explain to me that this is a divided kingdom and a spiritual kingdom, but now it's making a little bit more sense within the context of these other kingdoms that are on the beast, that are on the dragon. It also makes more sense in terms of Revelation 17 talking about the fornication of the woman with these kings of the earth and the woman who is riding the beast, who is controlling the beast. Now, I want to just mention, because in previous videos I've talked about the role of Russia and why Europe is so afraid of Russia. And I've made the statement that they're afraid of Russia because communism brought down papal Rome. Well, that's not actually accurate. If Bonapartism was not communism, then that's actually not accurate. So I want to make sure that I correct that. What does still remain is the fact that Russia calls themselves the Third Rome, and I'm sure that really bothers the harlot Catholic Church and Rome, and that Russia did pose a threat. But Russia has also been used as a distraction and as a scapegoat, and has been used in false prophecies and false interpretations of Scripture. Russia and China are not Gog and Magog, as some people are falsely claiming. And the very people who are falsely claiming that are actually Gog and Magog. That's the Antichrist kingdom that is being referenced in Ezekiel 38 and 39. That's not Russia and China. This is a spiritual war, you guys. This is not a physical war. What I'm demonstrating to you today is that we need to stop interpreting Scripture by our carnal understanding, continuing to remain in this physical thing that God has established. It's very similar to when Paul was telling his people that these works that God established were to help you understand your sin. Those works that he established, or the clean from the unclean, physically clean from the unclean, these things were established in order to help you understand spiritual things. But you need not stay in spiritual milk. You need to graduate to actual food and understand that the fulfillment of this is understood by what is spiritually clean versus unclean. And also, you are not to call what he has made clean unclean. And if you continue to remain in those works as the means by which you are going to be saved, you won't be saved. But what the people were saying is, you're trying to change all our traditions, you're trying to change what God has established, and he wasn't. He was trying to explain the fulfillment, and that's what I'm doing with you. What I'm doing with you is saying physical kingdoms were established in order for you to understand the fulfillment of spiritual kingdoms and us being harvested into one of two groups. There's only two. Only two. You're either in Christ's kingdom or you're in the Antichrist kingdom. The kingdom that's being described in Daniel 11 is the divided kingdom of the Antichrist and the various roles that people are playing. The harlot mother, the prostitutes that bore out of her, the false prophet of the United States, the image of the Antichrist. That right there, what I just described in that order, builds up to the Antichrist kingdom. Oh, one other thing. Europe, Western Europe. Babylon the Great, the mother of all prostitutes, the harlot Catholic Church, the prostitutes that bore out of her, the false prophet, and along with it, Europe, Western Europe, that rises to power and hands over its power to the Antichrist, and then the image of the Antichrist. And in the very end, we know that from Revelation 13 that the image of the Antichrist is going to be given power to kill all who will not receive its mark and will not worship it. Counterfeit Israel. We know that the false prophet is going to have power to prevent those who will not receive the mark of the beast from being able to buy or sell. So we call this blacklisting. Hopefully, this has been made clear to you, but you need to go discern it with God. So go sit with him. One last thing I want to say before I end this video is that one of the things that I noticed in listening to Kenneth Cox, that was the only, by the way, teaching that I had ever discerned to be true. Though there, of course, was that one place where I was kind of like, I don't know about that. Why is Bonapartism being conflated with atheistic communism? That transition is not seamless. And it bothered me, and I asked God about it many times, but he has really caused me to lean into it now. And maybe because he reveals things in season, and there was a part of that teaching that was still true. It's not that it's not true that Napoleon had that role. The part that's not true is that Napoleon equates to communism so that you can then, fulfill the narrative that the United States is the false prophet, which it is. It most definitely is. But this explanation makes that transition seamless, and it needs to be. But the thing that I want to tell you about Kenneth Cox and his teachings, I'm grateful that I was able to understand the history part, at least much of it. But I will say this. I know that the reason why he didn't understand this transition is because the Seventh-day Adventist Church is a prostitute. And you can't understand it if you insist on being in a prostitute and representing a prostitute. And there was another piece of doctrine that he did not understand, that he just brushed over, and that was Revelation 17:5, in which the Seventh-day Adventist community will tell you that the Antichrist is the harlot Catholic Church, but they neglect the fact that the harlot Catholic Church has prostitute daughters. They do not interpret what that means. And indeed, their entire shtick, their entire thing, hinges on this Saturday Sabbath, but they have not discerned where they got Saturday from. If God didn't name his days in the Bible, then you got to think, well, where did the names of those days come from? The Romans. And what did God establish? He established counting down his days. And you're counting down days from the new moon, because the moon is the faithful witness in the sky. And the new moon is the first day of the month. And so if you have the first day of the month that is a rest day according to Amos 8, they're not buying or selling on new moon, then you know that starting with the rest day, that the next 6 days are going to be work days. And then you're going to have a 7th day of rest, and then 6 days of work, and then a 7th day of rest. And that's going to happen 4 times in a month. And you're going to have 2 days in between which would be the 30th day of the month and the first day of the month, that are not 7-day weeks. They're not part of a 7-day week, because a week is defined as 6 days of work and 1 day of rest. But your 7-day Sabbaths are going to be the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th. So with there being 30-day months as established by the Bible, the 30th day would have been the first day of the week, but it's also the last day of the month, so it's not part of a week. The first day is going to be a rest day. So even though it's a Sabbath, it's not a 7-day Sabbath. It's not part of a week. So you have 2 days, and this is why the Festival of Weeks is stated as the Festival of Weeks and not stated as the Festival of Days, where you're counting down 50 days, because when you're counting down weeks, you got 4 weeks and then you've got 2 days in between, don't you? So you can't count down days. You can't do things the same way that the Romans set up and expect that to jive with what God set up. And so when Kenneth Cox would teach about these things, he was doing so from the perspective of representing a prostitute, and I can see that he did not have wisdom regarding the rest of the Antichrist kingdom. And it's the same thing that all of the prostitutes do. They point the finger at other denominations or at the harlot Catholic Church, and everybody else is wrong, but they don't see the plank in their own eye. They're justifying themselves by the condemnation of someone else. But if they had sat in the counsel of God, if they had examined themselves, then God would have moved them to truth. And so, as it is, you have the Seventh-day Adventist community who set up all kinds of medical hospitals, and I know a couple people who went to Seventh-day Adventist graduate schools, and I can tell you some stories about the evil that they do in those medical facilities, all the while talking about being Christian, 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 and yet they testify to a false god of science who attempts to covet and usurp God's power over his own creations and claim that there is no creator, that you evolved and come over here because we have some idols over here who are going to heal you. Oh, but we're Christian too. We're Christian too. They observe Christmas, Easter, Saturday Sabbath, tithing, the image of the cross. Are they prostitutes or not? Major prostitutes, come on, with major wealth. And yet they talk about the wealth of the Catholic Church all the time. They're just jealous. What about their own wealth? They have massive wealth. They have made a total marketplace of God. And they're going into the same lake of burning sulfur as the harlot Catholic Church, as their harlot mother. There's not going to be a difference between the lake of sulfur, the lake of burning sulfur that they go into versus anybody else who believes in this falsehood. If you don't fulfill your covenant, that's where you're going. Period. So I just want to make that statement about that. I don't want you thinking that because at one time I listened to this teaching from Kenneth Cox that I am endorsing him or what he stood for. It was simply God did end up using that teaching. That is the only teaching that he has used that even had nuggets of truth. So be very, very discerning about who you're listening to. Please discern this with God.